Today, we're facing a very interesting and timely discussion on realistic human security. Humanity faces critical challenges for which national responses are too narrow. New levels of cooperation are required for success. Every person is impacted by issues relating to the climate, biodiversity, nuclear weapons, the health of the ocean, equitable sustainable development, and pandemics, for example. In addressing these global challenges, many questions are presented. For example, how do we live in harmony with the natural world? How do we factor in questions of borders and sovereignties when trying to formulate a coherent, unified global responses to tackle global threats? How do we address real geopolitical adversities? We're lucky today to be joined by two distinguished speakers. They will go into a conversation for the first 30 to 40 minutes. You can ask questions during any time throughout the event by using the question and answers function. Now, it is my honor to introduce our guest speakers today. First, we have Dr. Jane Goodall. Dr. Jane Goodall, primatologist and anthropologist, is one of the world's most famous and influential scientists and inspiring humanitarians. She's known especially for her groundbreaking work on chimpanzees. She founded the Jane Goodall Institute and its inspiring program directed at youth empowerment and education. She will be speaking to Jonathan Granoff. Jonathan Granoff is president of the Global Security Institute and representative to the United Nations of the World Summit of Nobel Peace Laureates. He serves as senior advisor to the Committee on National Security of the International Law section of the American Bar Association, from which he received his 2020 Lifetime Achievement Award. Please all join me to welcome our speaker today. Now, I'm going to hand it over to Jonathan. Jonathan, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. And it's an honor to speak to so many students, I hope, because you are the future, you are our hope. I want to go right into like a very big question that I have of Jane. The background of the question is that the human activity is destroying biodiversity, destroying species at minimally 1,000 times the evolutionary base rate. And many scientists say it's 10,000 times the evolutionary base rate. So the entire ecosystem of the living systems of the planet, the oceans, the topsoil, the rainforests, etc., that human civilization depends upon is being destroyed. We're destroying the regenerative processes of nature. The status quo, the system whereby we heat our homes, get rid of garbage, produce garbage, get rid of garbage. The status quo is not realistic. It is not sustainable. So I want to ask your thoughts on how we have come to be out of harmony with the regenerative processes of nature and begin a framework of how we can come back into a realistic, sustainable relationship to the natural world.
Well, Jonathan, one of the ways in which we have reached this very dire situation, I mean, we are in dark times right now, politically, socially, and especially environmentally, facing the twin threats of climate change and loss of biodiversity. And then on top of that, we've got this pandemic, which is actually distracting us from the far greater existential threats of climate change and losing species. So how have we got here? Well, I suppose we've been getting here ever since the Industrial Revolution, but it hasn't reached the stage where it just is such an obvious threat until relatively recently. I think we've had the crazy notion that there can be unlimited economic development on a planet with finite natural resources. And already in some places, these are being used up faster than nature can replenish them. And the crazy notion that the annual growth of GDP is more important than protecting the environment for the future. So I came at this from understanding chimpanzees. They're closer to us than any other living creature. We share 98.6 or 7% of our DNA with them. And they're highly intelligent. They share emotions similar to ours: happiness, sadness, fear, despair, anger, grief, and so on. But although they are highly intelligent, we could talk about that later as it relates to other animals, the explosive development of our intellect is what's put us in the position we're in. And personally, I think that's because at some point in our evolution, we developed language, the power of using words so that we can talk about the past. We should be able to learn lessons from it. We're not very good at that, but we could. We can make plans for the distant future, like we planned this quite some time ago. And we can, most important of all, bring people together to discuss problems and try to find solutions. And that's put us in this position. So how is it possible that this most intellectual creature is destroying its only home? And I think what seems to have happened is a disconnect between this clever brain and the human heart, where poetically we seek love and compassion. And until head and heart work together, I don't think we can ever attain our true human potential.
That is I hadn't thought I would go here, but that is a great segue to an experience that I recently had just before the COVID hit us. I was in a expedition to above the Arctic Circle in Greenland, hosted by Uncle, a indigenous Eskimo elder. And it was an interfaith initiative, because one of the arrogances I don't think we can sustain is the arrogance of religious prejudice and pride, nor national pride over one another. So this was a group of people looking for human unity, and we went and I witnessed the melting of the polar ice cap. I intellectually understood it, but I hadn't felt it. And I saw where Uncle explained that when he was a child, it was 3 miles high, and now it was like 100 yards. And I could see places where huge, the size of buildings, of office buildings, were breaking off into these rivers of pure water that had been frozen for we don't know how long, probably billions of years. And just the scope and size of these rivers of pure water flowing into the oceans. And then I went up to a field that had been under the ice for, I don't know, millions, if not billions of years. And the stones there were so beautiful. They had geometric shapes in them, spirals, different colors. And I took a bunch of them and put them in my jacket. And we were going back to the base camp. And then my conscience hit me. I can't tell you, it was so interesting. It came from inside. Stop the bus. And I jumped off and I ran back and I put them back where they belonged. And I experienced something in my heart, a connectivity and a sense of shame that we've set up a system which is so rewards a process that is destroying the regenerative processes of nature. If 100 years ago someone had said, we're going to set up a system whereby we can melt the polar ice cap, people would have laughed and said, that's too grandiose. Well, Jane, we went from there and we went to Assisi. And in Assisi, we had an interfaith service with imams, rabbis, priests, ministers, swamis, and peace activists like myself who are working on inner and outer peace at the shrine of St. Francis. And there, our Eskimo elder said, and you heard him say this at the UN, I believe also, he said something to the effect of, my brothers and sisters from the South, you have found a way to melt the polar ice cap. When will you develop a technology to melt the human heart? And that really hit me. And
I just want to interrupt one second, because he said that to me, and I said it in my lectures. And he said to me, is it okay if I also talk about melting the ice in the human heart? And I said, well, you said it in the first place. He said, oh, did I?
Right. Well, I felt also when I heard him say it at the UN at the Millennium Peace Summit, that he was channeling truth in some way, that there was no ego in it at all. It was a gift of truth to all of us, a message that there is something, there is a sense of the sacred, a sense of the gift of the web of life that we seem to have forgotten, and that we're treating the natural world merely as a resource to satisfy us, rather than as something that we need to learn from and live in harmony with. I was thinking about how our economic system, when corporations report on their activities, the reporting is all toward the financial system, which we create, and the natural world and the impact of our activities on the natural world is considered, for accounting purposes, an externality that you don't have to report on. It would seem to me that nature is not going to adjust to our corporate needs, and that we need to have reporting on the impact on nature first and foremost, and only after that reporting on the things that we've created, the financial system. Because the financial system can be adjusted, but we can't adjust nature. And I guess it's this disconnect that you're talking about. How did you come about making that connection? Because Jane, you are not only one of a wise elder to people like myself and many, many millions of others, but I know that you went on a journey that you're a scientist, but somehow you're speaking from the heart to the heart of people, and you made that journey.
Well, actually, the journey is a bit different than you suggest, Jonathan, because my journey didn't begin as a scientist. And just for the record, I also stood with Uncle at the polar ice cap when it was much higher than when you were there with him. It was still melting fast, but it's interesting. We both did the same thing, and so I went straight from there to Panama, where people had already left their island homes because at high tide they were not suitable. And that's partly because of all the melting ice and glaciers and icebergs, but also because as the water heats because of climate change, it expands. And that, of course, is causing havoc around the world. But how did I make my journey? Well, it started right here where I'm speaking from. This is where I grew up in England, in Bournemouth, and books behind me, which I read as a child. And I started off loving animals. I was born loving animals. And, all those years ago, like nearly 80 years ago, women weren't scientists or anything like that. So when at age 10, I started saying, well, I'm going to grow up and go to Africa and live with wild animals and write books about them, because, as I say, no thought of being a scientist, everybody laughed. But this is where I want to bring in a very important person in my journey, my mother, because where everybody else laughed at me and said I'd never get there, it's far away, we didn't have money, World War II was raging, and anyway, I was just a girl. But she said, if you really want to do something like this, you're going to have to work really hard, take advantage of every opportunity, and then if you don't give up, you may find a way. And I take that message to young people around the world. It's a wonderful legacy she left, because so many people have said or written to me, Jane, I really want to thank you because you taught me that because you did it, I can do it too. So thank you, Mum. So anyhow, well, we won't go into it, but I did get to Africa, but not as a scientist. And no, I hadn't been to college. We couldn't afford it. But the interesting thing is that Louis Leakey, my mentor, chose me partly because I hadn't been to college, because as he knew only too well, the attitude of science back then in the early 60s was so reductionist when it came to thinking about animals. And so he was very glad that I had an unbiased mind. And he was glad that I was a female, because he thought maybe females are more patient, because during evolution we had to be patient to look after these wretched little children that come along. So anyhow, I began not as a scientist, as a naturalist. And it was Lewis who pushed me into going to Cambridge to do a PhD, even without having got an undergraduate degree, because he said there was no time to mess about with that. So I was very nervous. And when I got there, can you imagine how horrified I was to be told by many professors I'd done everything wrong? I couldn't talk about the chimpanzees having names. Numbers was more scientific. I couldn't talk about them having personalities, minds capable of solving problems, and certainly not emotions. I was guilty of that worst of all crimes, anthropomorphism, attributing human-like behavior to non-human animals. But fortunately, the other person who's here with me, they're both on this side, Mum up at the top, and down below is me with my childhood teacher, my dog Rusty. And he'd already taught me long before the chimps that the professors in this respect were absolutely wrong, and that we are not the only beings with personalities, minds, and emotions on this planet. So that's how I began. So it's not surprising that I very quickly developed a spiritual connection with the forests in which the chimpanzees live.
So it was the forest that opened your heart, really.
Yes, when I'm in the forest, especially when I'm alone, I just feel this close connection. And one day I was thinking, this is as though every living thing around me, the insects, the birds, the trees, they have a little spark of this creator, this great spiritual force that I feel so strongly. And because we like to label things, that spark in us we call a soul. So if I have a soul, I agree with many of the indigenous people that the animals, the birds, the plants, they're our brothers and sisters. They have souls too.
Well, that sense of harmony with nature is not only with the indigenous people, it's actually, you can actually find it in the Upanishads, you can find it in the Quran, and you can even find it in the Bible, because it is part of the architecture. When we recover our humanity, part of what you perceive is that every day the sunset, the sunrise is miraculous, and 50 to 70% of our oxygen comes from the phytoplankton, which depends on the health of the oceans. And the idea that that's somehow external to our humanity is simply not realistic. It is part of our lungs, as are the rainforests. And the idea that the natural world is separate from the human community is mythical. It's a mental construction that I don't think is realistic. So for me, the very first premise of human security is that we have to recognize the reality of the natural world and its regenerative processes. We don't have a choice.
It's not only that, Jonathan, it's also that we're part of it, as you say, but we depend on it. Even if we live in the middle of a big city, we depend on the natural world for the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food, everything. But what we depend on is healthy ecosystems. And I see an ecosystem, my forest, for example, it's like a beautiful living tapestry. And within that tapestry, every species of plant and animal has a role to play. And if one of those species becomes extinct within that ecosystem, It's like pulling a thread from the tapestry. And if you pull enough threads, your tapestry hangs in tatters and your ecosystem collapses. And we depend on healthy ecosystems.
And-
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but just
No, please. No, you didn't interrupt me, Jane. That web of life, I think, is the framework that we have to begin to address human security. And human security is the framework of that human beings have a right to live in dignity, free from want and fear. And that policy should, first and foremost, policies of states and corporations need to focus on that as the very first premise of all policy. And right now, the way in which security is pursued by the major states of the world is based on a national military model, which has various streams in it, one being strategic stability, huge arsenals squared off that render it irrational to use them because it would be self-destructive. But we now know that if less than 1% of the 13,000 nuclear weapons in the world were used, it would throw at least 5 million tons of soot into the stratosphere. And even the party that used them first would destroy their own ecosystem and the agricultural base of civilization. So we've gone from mutually assured destruction to self-assured destruction, from mad to sad. Then the other narrative we have is, so internationally, the big countries, there's 9 countries with a nuclear weapon, say, trust us. We will bring security to the world and stability with these huge arsenals. The US has just pledged several trillion to modernize the arsenal, and Russia and China and India and Pakistan are, following suit and modernizing and creating faster, more dangerous weapons, the end of which will have no better security and will violate the principle of building cooperation, trust, and working together on these real problems. Then so it's based on this idea that if you prepare for war, you'll receive peace. It's a Roman maxim, and that's military training. So internationally, they say, trust us with strategic stability. And nationally, they all say, oh, we'll get military advantage. And the more the weapons are produced, the more fear there is, and the more weapons make sense. Kind of macabre sense. But we saw that when Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan got together and said a nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought, and we will not seek military advantage over each other. They said that in 1985. They instituted a cycle of virtue. Trust but verify, as Reagan said. They instituted a cycle of virtue that took us down from over 65,000 nuclear weapons to what we have now, less than 14,000. But more importantly, they opened up the process of ending the Cold War. And now we have globalization of culture, science, art, medicine, and of course now we're faced with global threats that require cooperation, that we simply have to cooperate to address the pandemic. We have to cooperate to protect the climate. We have to cooperate to protect the oceans. So the admonition of the wise to see the human family as one, to respect the web of life, to treat others as we want to be treated, which was always a spiritual principle, it seems to me it's now become necessary that if we don't deal with these problems cooperatively and we put them on the side and we spend literally trillions of dollars in methods of killing each other to pursue security, will not be realistic.
No,
it's mythical.
That's absolutely true. But the trouble is, you say we have to do this and we have to do this. We do, but we don't. We're not. There's always people out there who just don't want to listen. They just want to carry on with business as usual. They just want to carry on with weaponizing with making money, with gaining power. And that's the problem. So you and I, and probably everybody listening to us, we know that that's what needs to happen. But how do we persuade some of these other people who don't want to listen, who don't seem to care? And from my perspective, there will never be peace on the planet until we learn to live in harmony with nature, because already there's conflict over access to water, which thanks to climate change is getting scarcer and scarcer in some places. There's conflict over access to land in some places, conflict over access to fisheries. Britain is involved in that, Britain and France. I mean, it's really shocking when you think about that. And everybody who's got a brain in their head, anybody who cares two hoots about the future, they agree with you and me. But then there are these people who don't.
Well, one of the problems is that people like you and I, we tend to think for ourselves, and we have a great variety of points of view, and we respect diversity. We spend a lot of time being siloed and taking on and arguing with each other instead of working together and pulling at the same time. I think there's a natural coalition on the planet of people who care about human rights, people who care about social justice, gender equity, tolerance, the rule of law, protecting the environment, and peacefully living together. And you have the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, but they're siloed. And that's why I think the concept of human security, of looking at policy, how does it affect the man on the street? How does it, I mean, the best articulation of this, I think, is Mahatma Gandhi's, where he says, if you want to see if a policy is effective or not, think about the most disenfranchised person you've ever seen. And think, is this policy a burden to them or a benefit to them? Or it's even in the Bible where Jesus says, you know, what you do to the least amongst you, you do to me. And if we look at the several billion people on the planet who are really, really being crushed by this irresponsible behavior toward the natural world, as you pointed out, water and diseases and the suffering. I mean, there's over 2 billion people without clean, potable water.
Yeah.
And if you look at their, and policies are focused on that, not only is there a sense of dignity and virtue in it, but it's practical. It's practical. An example would be after World War I, reparations were burdened on the German people. They were suffering. They were vanquished, and we received the chaos of Nazism. But after World War II, not only was the UN system created and doctrine of human rights and many good things, but there was also the Marshall Plan, in which the enemies, particularly Japan and Germany, had their economies reinforced with generosity, the consequence being trading partners and democracies. So for people, some people say, oh, well, this is idealism, this is mythical. That's not the case. The fact is that we have seen how virtue in practice, the rule of law in practice, justice in practice, equity in practice actually brings greater stability. And you can see it in your personal life too. You know, I mean, when you break the golden rule in your family, there's always going to be chaos. But what's the best security is when your neighbors want to live with you in harmony and trade with you.
And Jonathan, you know, I think of just about every country, and I think about the horrible discrimination, the caste system, the way that people treat different religions. We've got so far to go. And yeah, these goals, they're the ideals we have to strive for. And we need those goals out there. We need to know what we ought to do. And so this is why I'm concentrating so much on the youth with our Jane Goodall Institute Roots and Shoots program, because it's now for children of every age, from kindergarten, very strong in university. I hope students are listening. because the university students are doing so much good. But we're even in some adult groups. But as well as the main message, every single individual matters and makes a difference every day. And unless we're living in poverty, we can choose what sort of difference we make. But we've got to alleviate poverty for this to really work. And every group, because of the interconnection, they choose between them 3 projects, one to help people, one to help animals, and one to help the environment. But at the same time, because we're now in 68 countries, 68 countries, I think that's right, we tried to bring young people together with different cultures, languages, nationalities, religions. And we haven't taught this, but they just automatically come to realize that the color of the skin, the language, the culture, the religion is far less important than the fact that we're all human beings. And this is how we have to spread it from the bottom up. Time is the big problem, isn't it? This window of time we have before climate change. I mean, I don't know, Jonathan, there's a film made that just haunts me, and I forget its name, but it's about Bangladesh, which is being washed away by sea level rise, and also because India keeps flooding the Ganges when the monsoon starts. And seeing these people who once lived proudly, fishing, doing a bit of farming, and they move back away from the eroding land, but then there's nowhere for them to go. They're ending up in slums in the cities with no sanitation, no running water, no electricity, and it's heartbreaking.
Well, we know the solutions. The solutions, as you pointed out, good thinking people know the solutions.
Yeah.
And but I want to point out the power of ought. Some people say, well, you have to be realistic. So I'm very big on America. I'm an American. And the founding vision of the creation of the country was articulated by Thomas Jefferson when he said, all men are created equal. Now, we now know that of course has to include women. But when he said it, it certainly didn't include women. It certainly didn't include people of color. It certainly didn't include the indigenous people who lived here. And it didn't even include people who didn't have property. But he meant it. When you look at his philosophical framework, he put that as an ought. And we certainly haven't reached that ought, but it has been a compelling magnet of organization and virtue ever since. And even the worst despots in the planet pay the price of hypocrisy and say, oh, we're trying to bring equality into our country and democracy. So I think that the vision of promoting human security as a necessity and a realistic framework is the ought that we have to put forward, rather than putting nationalism first. The state didn't always exist. The modern state was created in 1648 to stop the 30 Years' War in Europe, where Catholics and Protestants were slaughtering each other, saying whose understanding of Jesus' love was better. And the state was created to stop that war. It was a tool that we created. And so the sovereignty of the state comes from the people. And so to deal with global threats that we have now, protecting the oceans, protecting the climate, protecting the rainforest, addressing pandemics, addressing the great disparities of wealth, et cetera, that's not diminishing sovereignty. That's actually fulfilling the needs of the people. And the argument that this diminishes sovereignty, I think, is unrealistic, because it's not grounded in the reality that we create the state to serve our needs. And there's no way any state can do its first duty, which is to protect its citizens, without protecting the phytoplankton of the oceans, which we need to breathe. And Yesterday, I read a journal article by Dr. Sabin, who was one of the people who helped create a vaccine against polio. Same with Jonas Salk. But in this article, he talked about how behind the scenes, the governments of the Soviet Union and the United States encouraged scientists to cooperate. They didn't tell their populations. And then he said, Sabin, this is decades ago, he said, we have cured and controlled by cooperation the problem of polio. We should use the same principle of cooperation to address poverty. I was just so struck by that. And then I was struck by, I did an article in Newsweek about not wanting to have a vaccine apartheid world. And I called Jonas Salk's son to ask about his father and his attitude toward addressing the global threat of polio. And he was interviewed by the great journalist Edward R. Murrow, who said, who owns the patent? And Dr. Salk said, the people own the patent. It's like the sunshine. So, you know, Jane, there are so many people who have made that journey from the head to the heart and who do so much. And we've got to work together. And that's why I think the principle of human security is a rallying cry for this time. To say, to have something that brings us all together in policy.
Yeah, we definitely need that. But, you know, I'm just going to slightly shift gear for a second, because you reminded me of it when you were talking about the vaccine for polio. So when we get vaccines and cures, what do? It's mandatory that they're tested on animals, even though there are new technologies which make it more efficient for people. And we are at this moment, because of the pandemic, literally torturing hundreds and thousands of monkeys, sentient beings, many of them because the breeding labs can't keep up with the demand of the scientists who are racing to get these vaccines. I'm not blaming them, but I am blaming the people who tear these baby monkeys from the wild, these very social, highly intelligent beings, put them in tiny cages, ship them around the world, and then from the monkey's point of view, torturing them. The way they're treated would make you sick, the secretly filmed videos, and the way that animals are treated on the factory farms, because people want to eat more and more and more meat, whereas we need to shift towards a plant-based diet. So it was Gandhi, you quoted Gandhi, I'll quote him too. You can judge something of a nation by the way it treats its animals. Well, the way we're treating animals makes basically most of the human race into monsters.
That's a strong condemnation, Jane, and it's interesting because seeing the Buddhist first truth, which is that there is suffering, there is ignorance, and realizing it fully. And I know you to be one of the happiest people I know. And all the happiest people I know see the suffering and commit to work to eliminate it as much as possible.
Yeah, which I do.
Which you do.
Yeah.
And then such people I have observed in my 73 years here on the planet are the most fulfilled and the happiest. And that the people who ignore and pretend that there isn't suffering and pretend there isn't old age, sickness, and death, and there isn't suffering, and don't try to develop compassion in action, and are perpetually selfish, end up lonely and depressed.
Yeah, probably.
That seeing war, pestilence, disease, and irresponsibility in a way compels us to action if you feel it. If you feel it. And then the consequence I can see in you, and you've been an inspiration to me, is a human being who is full of love and joy and hope inside.
Lots of hope. But, you know, I keep talking to these animal rights groups, well, all kinds of groups that care about injustice. And they get angry and they point a finger and they tell people they're bad people and they've got to change. That doesn't work. The only way people really change is if you reach the heart. And I do that with stories. I don't go around being angry at people. I give these researchers the benefit of the doubt. They may be completely ignorant. And you remember with Gallo, with the HIV/AIDS, he invented the vaccine along with whoever it was, I can't remember, in France. Anyway, I told him about the chimps in the labs. And he said, but Jane, I don't know anything about chimps. I just asked for a little bit of serum in a bottle. And I said, well, if I give you my book, will you read it? And he did. And he turned into somebody, well, anyway, he found the chimps, even though they're so like us, weren't useful. But still, he turned into an ally rather than, and he invited me to speak at his big AIDS conferences.
So it was respect. It was the respect that Gorbachev and Reagan had for one another that helped end the Cold War. And I have seen how treaties get created and how diplomats and lawyers are so important in being the bridge to changing the institutions that need to be changed. And in the media, we see too many military people, and it's time for some questions.
Thank you, Jay and Jonathan, for your wonderful conversation, sharing your insight and your journey to where you are today. I think on that note about how individual leaders, when they working together, they could do a lot of good for the global community. I've got a member who asked this question. Desi, who asked, countries like Brazil that will keep cutting the trees despite the known consequences, how do we deal with individual leaders who are refusing to acknowledge climate change? I guess all those questions will apply to both of you, and feel free to answer if you want to go first.
I'm going to leave that one to Jonathan. You can deal with Bolsonaro.
Well, it's obvious that we need to have a legal regime to protect the rainforests. The rainforests are at least 30% of our air, our oxygen, and they are our collective lungs. And protecting the rainforest is a global public good of the highest order. And destroying the rainforest is based on the idea that a nation owns this natural necessity for human survival is not realistic. But it is realistic and necessary that the international community have a legally enforceable, verifiable regime to protect the oceans and the rainforests as fast as possible. It's not realistic to put that aside. And we won't get there until we have a paradigm of security that says human security comes first and national security depends on human security. And of course, as Jane points out, there's no such thing as human security in a degraded environment. So we need to change the narrative from national sovereignty to national sovereignty is really important, but there are limits to it. Just like I own a house, but I have to abide by the local laws.
Yeah, but Jonathan, to reach that stage, it's going to take time, and we don't have that time. The rate with which the rainforest is going, and a lot of that is to do with grazing for cattle, back again to this desire to eat more and more and more meat, which is bad for us, bad for the environment, and certainly bad for the animals.
Mm-hmm. So far, we've seen steps taken at this year's COP26 conference. So I want to specifically go to Jane on this question. What are some of the lessons we've learned from this year's conference, and what's your takeaway? Are you happy with how it was conducted?
Well, I have to say that if all the pledges and commitments are followed through by the governments that made them and the businesses that made them, then it would be a very successful conference. And I say if, because similar commitments have been made before and they haven't been enforced. So for me, I'm sitting on the wall and I'm waiting. I think I was very shocked to find the largest lobbying group in the whole of Glasgow was the oil and gas lobbying group. They're so powerful. And some of these people, some of these companies, they're just so powerful, and they basically control governments because they fund election campaigns and they make bargains, and then they have to pay back with, sometimes with natural resources, like China. I mean, Africa agreed to hand over many of its natural resources in return for roads and infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. Now I want to look to Jonathan. When we talk about the promises being made at a UN conference, do you think the United Nations remain as an effective international organization to make sure those things are implemented? If not, what should we resort otherwise if the United Nations are not able to help us to maintain this international rules-based system to keep the countries to keep to their words?
There is no, we would have to recreate another place like the UN where the people of the world and all countries can talk to each other. The UN is insufficiently empowered to fulfill its task. Its budget is less than $40 billion a year. Our military expenditures are close to $2 trillion a year. My country is pushing, if you include some of the black budget, at least 800 billion. 800 billion compared to a place in which global security is to be pursued. The equation is completely disconnected. If you look at the treaty regimes that are husbanded by the UN, they are what allow international commerce, international trade to take place. They're what allow businesses to operate in an international legal regime through the arbitration treaty, the New York Treaty it's called, that you can fly into airports all over the world because of the treaties dealing with aeronautics at the UN. We wouldn't have this international capacity to communicate without the UN. The background of the global village that we live in which we can talk to each other with these gizmos, depends on the UN system. I look at the counterfactual. What if we didn't have a UN? Like the League of Nations collapsed, and there wasn't a place where the people of the world and a community of diplomats can talk to each other. That's absolutely dysfunctional. The UN is a place in which you can say we and actually mean the entire human community. There isn't any other such institution. But most people don't realize how much we depend on it. Intellectual property through the Berne Convention. So you have a patent, you create an invention, it gets protected in most of the world. Does the law get violated? Do treaties get violated? Of course they do. But in the same way as we have laws to prohibit murder. Does murder still take place? Yes. Does that mean we throw out the murder laws? Of course not. We need to strengthen the culture of peace that leads people to live in greater harmony and not commit so many murders and keep the law that prohibits it. And similarly, at a global level, we need to encourage the cycles of disarmament and cooperation that breed greater trust. Now, people are cynical about that, but the fact is we've gone down from over 65,000 nuclear weapons to less than 14,000, and there are treaty regimes that commit the nuclear weapon states to negotiate the elimination of nuclear weapons. So it's our job to say, one, it's unrealistic to continue to depend on this ultimate insane adversity that institutionalizes adversity and the threat of human annihilation, and fulfill the legal requirements of negotiating the elimination of these horrific devices, and get on with the real task of protecting our planet home. Now, where can that take place? The United Nations.
Mm-hmm. Before I move on to Dr. Goodall, I think there's one question from a member of the audience followed up on what Jonathan has just said. Sue commented, too often the wrong people are in the room, as powerful people have too much to lose. Shifting to the rule of law and responsibility, accountability and transparency include removing private ownership of nature. As a lawyer, Jonathan, how can you lead and guide this essential transformation?
One of the human rights is the right of property. And so if you don't have property, if you don't have people's ability to have property, it's very difficult for people to have liberty and moral agency. I mean, one of the reasons for the Reformation was that the markets were controlled by the Holy Roman Empire. And in some countries, governments control all of the property. And if they control all of the property, then people are just licensed and they don't have freedom of speech. They don't have freedom of ideas. They can't be creative. So property is very important. On the other hand, there have to be limits to that. And the regenerative processes of the natural world cannot be expropriated in individual or national interest. They are the common goods. So just like you have highways and roads in a society that everybody can travel on, there are global common goods such as the health of the oceans and the health of the climate that cannot and must not be expropriated. We have to first and foremost protect our lungs, the rainforests, the oceans. So there have to be limits on what can be turned into property. And then there is great value in freedom of property ownership and the creativity that comes in science and intellectual property. We all benefit from that, but there have to be limits and balances.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jonathan. A question for Jane. The one-word title of your book sends a message into a world which is experiencing a remarkable period of hopelessness. How might the message of hope prevail, notably at all levels of governance?
Well, I think just very simply stated, if we all lose hope, we're doomed, because hope is something, I look at hope now as something which requires action. So right now we're in a very dark tunnel. Imagine we're in this dark tunnel. It's a long tunnel. And right at the end is a little spark of light. That spark is hope. But I don't sit at my end of the tunnel and hope that that light will come to me. I've got to work really hard to crawl under, climb over, work around all the obstacles that lie in the way between me and that little light. And I've met many people who've lost hope. In fact, the whole Roots and Shoots program began because young people, and this is way back in the late 1980s, they were losing hope. And this was in every country. And they said, well, you've compromised our future, meaning older generations, and there's nothing we can do about it. Well, we have compromised our children's future with no question. We've been stealing it. Ever since the Industrial Revolution, we've been stealing their future as we exploit these finite natural resources. But is it too late? No, we've got this precious window of time. And so Roots and Shoots began, and I've explained it. And it's given young people hope. So if I meet somebody who's depressed and says, well, the world is in such a mess, there's nothing I can do about it, I say, stop thinking about the global mess, because you can't deal with that. But think about something you can actually do, whatever it happens to be in your community or something you really care about. And roll up your sleeves and do it. And you will do it, and that will make you feel good. That's a wonderful thing about us. You do something good for somebody or the planet, and it makes you feel good. So then you want to do more, because then we want to feel better. Mm-hmm. And the more we do to feel better, the more we inspire others, and so they join us. So my reasons for hope are very simple. That first of all, this God-given brain that we haven't always used wisely, but think how science is coming up with alternative ways of living that are less damaging to the environment, like renewable energy, for example. And so another reason for hope is the amazing ability of nature to regenerate. And at one point around the Gombe National Park, where we still study chimps, the hills were bare. More people living there than the land could support, too poor to buy food from elsewhere, struggling to survive. And that's when I realized, well, if we don't help these people find ways of making a living without destroying their environment, we can't save chimpanzees, forests, or anything else. And so we began our Take Care to Kari program. And it was very holistic, because there's no point tackling one piece of a problem and not another. There's no point tackling health if you don't tackle education and so on. So it became extremely successful. It's now in all the villages throughout Chimp Range in Tanzania. And the bare hills have gone. They're not there anymore. Mother Nature, given a chance, has this amazing restorative power. And I know one of the biggest areas that was absolutely destroyed is the lowest plateau in China. And with a lot of people working on it, it's now green and lush and water flowing again. And so nature's restorative power, then the energy and commitment of young people, once they have been listened to and empowered to take action, is incredibly inspiring. And finally, what I call the indomitable human spirit, the people who tackle what seems impossible and won't give up. And what I'm always saying is each one of us has that indomitable spirit, but so many people are afraid to let it out, to make it grow. And if we all gave free rein to our indomitable spirit for good, what a different world it would be.
Mm-hmm. I want to now move on to my final question, addressing to both of you. Jane earlier in her opening remark said, people sometimes overly focus on the concept of GDP as a measure of growth. Do you think GDP has become an obstacle to achieve realistic human security? If so, what other alternative measures can help us to come onto a track of sustainable development? I want to go to Jonathan first and then Jane.
Well, GDP it measures gross domestic product. It doesn't measure the love of a mother for their children and taking care of families. It doesn't measure the most important journey we take after we've been here for a while, which is leaving the planet, the dignity of leaving. It doesn't measure the security of communities. It doesn't measure the quality of education. It doesn't measure whether there's social equity in a society. It doesn't measure general public health. It just measures a very limited part of the human endeavor. But if we look at what builds well-being in communities, it has to do with security in your family. It has to do with the educational opportunities you have. It has to do with public health. And mainly it has to do with whether there's peace and the quality of human unity in a community. And that goes to whether a community is peaceful and whether there's the rule of law and harmony. So the GDP is inadequate. We need to have a much more holistic approach to our public well-being. In the same way as 20 years ago, a doctor would only look at your body in a very atomized way. Now we have to look at it holistically. But the most important part of the well-being of communities goes to the qualities that are encouraged in people. When there's the encouragement of a culture of caring for one another, there is a greater level of happiness. There's lots of scientific studies to this effect. There's there's just so much science is showing us the greater we care for one another, the happier we become.
And Jane, want to hear your response to that question.
Well, after all that, I'll just make one or two small remarks. And that is that we very, very clearly need a new relationship with the natural world. We cannot go on exploiting these finite natural resources the way we have been. And I think the pandemic has really highlighted this somehow, because a lot of people for the first time heard birds singing in their garden they couldn't hear before because of all the traffic. And of course the traffic's come back, but that little experience, some people for the first time breathed clean air because the factories were shut down for a while. And so having learned what the world could and should be like, they're less happy with the way it was and unfortunately still is. So I am not in a position to work out exactly how we practically move towards a new relationship with the natural world, except that those of us who live in affluent circumstances, we need to reduce our ecological footprint, consciously reduce it. We definitely need to alleviate poverty. because that is causing people to destroy the environment in their desperate need to grow more food or make charcoal. In a city, they'll buy the cheapest junk food. They can't afford to ask us. We can. Did it harm the environment in its making? Was it cruel to animals? Is it cheap because of unfair wages that are paid to people along the supply chain and at the point of origin of the things, or perhaps some kind of slave labor? And the good news, to end on a positive note, is that corporations absolutely are beginning to change. And I talked to one CEO the other day, about 3 weeks ago. He was CEO of a big international corporation. And he told me that for the last 8 years or so, he'd been really working to make his company more environmentally and socially responsible. And he said, Jane, there were 3 reasons for this. One, I saw the writing on the wall. I saw that we're using up these natural resources too fast. And if we go on with business as usual, that'll be the end of my business, probably everybody else's business too. Secondly, consumer pressure. More people are aware. More people are demanding products that have been ethically produced as far as the environment and people are concerned. But he said what really was the tipping point for me was about 10 years ago. My little girl was 10 years old and she came home from school and she said, Daddy, they tell me that what you're doing is hurting the planet. That's not true, is it, Daddy? Because it's my planet, isn't it? That got to his heart.
On that wonderful note, unfortunately, we have run out of time for today's discussion, but we've not run out of time to save the planet and humanity. I hope everyone can take away the note, the message of hope and never give up. On behalf of the membership, I want to thank you once again, Jane and Jonathan, for sharing your wisdom. And hopefully this video will be readily viewed by everyone and take away that good message of hope. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.